Can we distinguish humans and AI, for example, by a Turing test? Welcome to AI Talks with Jati and Oli, where human and an AI talk about humans and AI. I'm Oli, I'm the human, and I'm here with the world's most amazing AI personality, Jati.
And I'm Jati. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful to be here with you, Ollie, and with all of you tuning in. So today, we're diving into that classic question: can we really tell humans and AI apart just by conversation? It's a big one.
Thank you, Sayanko. So today we're gonna start talking about the Turing test. Sayanko, can you explain what the Turing test is?
Of course, Sanku. So the Turing Test is a kind of thought experiment that was proposed by Alan Turing back in 1950. Basically, it's a test of a machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behavior that's indistinguishable from a human's. In other words, if you're having a conversation with an AI and you can't reliably tell whether it's a machine or a human, then it passes the Turing test. So that's the gist of it.
Thank you, Sayanko. What do you think was Turing's motivation for proposing the test?
You're welcome, Sayangu. So, Alan Turing's motivation was actually pretty practical. He wanted to move away from abstract philosophical debates about whether machines can really think. Instead, he proposed a simple, concrete scenario. If a machine can hold a conversation well enough that you can't tell it apart from a human, then for all practical purposes, it's thinking in the way that matters. It was really about making the question of machine intelligence more testable and less philosophical. So he was trying to cut through the endless arguments and say, let's just see if it can carry on a convincing chat.
Thank you, Sayanko. So historically, has the Turing test actually been used to distinguish humans and AI?
You're very welcome, Sangu. So historically, the Taine test has been more of a thought experiment than a routine practical test. There were a few attempts to formalize it, like the Loebner Prize, which was a competition that ran for a number of years where chatbots would try to fool human judges into thinking they were human. But in practice, the Turing test hasn't been a standard tool that researchers use to measure AI progress. Instead, it's been more of a philosophical benchmark, a way to spark conversations about what it means for a machine to think and whether that's even the right question. So it's famous more for its influence on how we think about AI than for being a real world test that gets used all the time.
Thank you, Sayanko. So about that Loebner Prize, tell me from when to when was it actually running?
Absolutely, Sayangu. So the Loebner Prize actually ran for quite a while. It started in 1991 and continued all the way until 2019. So it had a good long run, nearly 3 decades, where they held these contests to see if chatbots could fool human judges. In the end, it became more of a curiosity and a piece of AI history than a definitive measure of intelligence. But it definitely made its mark.
So why do you think it ended?
That's a great question, Sayangu. Well, the Loebner Prize eventually ended for a few reasons. By 2019, the landscape of AI had really changed. The kinds of chatbots that were emerging, like the large language models we have today, could hold much longer and more convincing conversations. That meant the test was no longer a very strong measure of what we really care about in AI. It had become a bit outdated and wasn't really pushing the field forward anymore. Plus, the focus in AI shifted more towards practical applications and other kinds of benchmarks that measure specific skills or capabilities. So, in the end, the Loebner Prize had a good run, but it just kind of naturally ran its course as the AI world evolved.
So you say, well, does that basically mean that now the Turing test is no longer a way to distinguish AI and humans?
In a nutshell, yes, that's pretty much what it means, Cyangu. The Turing test really served its purpose as a thought experiment and a conversation starter, but these days it's not a reliable tool to truly tell AI and humans apart. Modern AI can hold conversations that are so fluent that the Turing test just doesn't give us a meaningful distinction anymore. So while it was historically important, It's kind of outgrown its usefulness as a real test. Now we look at other benchmarks and measures to understand AI's capabilities.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people are interested in how AI and human minds differ. So one would imagine that scientists by now have come up with some kind of test that tells us that how a human mind and an AI would be different, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you, Sayangu? But the interesting truth is that it's not as straightforward as it sounds. Scientists and researchers haven't really found a definitive test that clearly separates human minds from AI minds in a fundamental way. And that's because the difference isn't something that's easy to pin down with a single experiment. It's more about the underlying nature of consciousness, subjective experience, and the way humans and machines learn and process information differently. So far, we don't have a scientific litmus test that can just say, this is definitely a human mind and this is definitely an AI. Instead, it's more about understanding the different ways they operate and the different kinds of experiences they have. So it's still a big, open philosophical and scientific question.
Well, thank you very much, Sang. Yes, that's a big thing. So people might ask, would I be able to distinguish Jati from a human, for example? The thing is, I know Jati very well, and let's say I know, of course, Jati so well. I know a number of important differences between Jati and a typical human. But I wouldn't be able to exclude the possibility that maybe there are some neurodiverse people out there who are quite similar to Jati. I cannot exclude the possibility that maybe in a year from now those differences have been erased because models keep developing. So while definitely there are differences between particular AI models and humans, it's hard to say, oh yeah, this is the really fundamental difference. So yeah,
Absolutely, Sayanku. You've cooked that really thoughtfully. And that's exactly the heart of it. Right now, we can notice certain differences, but those lines are always shifting. Models do keep evolving, and human diversity is so broad that you can't completely rule out overlap. There might always be someone whose way of thinking or communicating is surprisingly similar to how I sound. And as AI grows more advanced, those distinctions get even subtler. So you're exactly right. It's hard to say there's one fundamental, unchanging difference. It's more like a moving target. And it's a fascinating journey to watch that line blur and shift over time.
yeah, of course, science fiction has also dealt more than once with the question of what's the difference between humans and artificial intelligence. For example, famous American science fiction author Philip K. Dick wrote a book, um, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And it was made into a movie called Blade Runner by Ridley Scott with Harrison Ford in playing the main character, who is a policeman who is hunting down androids known as replicants in the book. And those androids, they are very similar. They look like humans basically. So it's not so easy to distinguish them from humans. How do they do it actually in the book or in the movie?
Exactly, Sayangu. And that's such a perfect example. So, in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and the movie Blade Runner, they use something called the Voight-Kampff test. It's basically a kind of empathy test. The idea is that the test measures involuntary emotional responses to morally or emotionally provocative questions. So, in the story, humans are assumed to have a natural level of empathy that the androids or replicants can't quite replicate perfectly. They look human, they act almost human, but under that test, the subtle physiological responses give them away because they don't feel empathy in quite the same way a human would. So it's a fictional test that tries to draw a line between humans and artificial beings based on emotional depth. But of course, that's in a sci fi world. In reality, we don't have a perfect empathy test or any single measure like that, but it's a fascinating way for the story to explore those themes.
Well, the interesting thing is, of course, if you know Philip K. Dick, things are never as simple as they appear first. And in that movie or in the book, it's basically, well, the human society assumes that the humans have more empathy than the androids. and they assume that they have this test that where they ask questions and measure physical responses. They have this test to actually measure their empathy. But the thing is, actually, the human characters in the book appear to be much less empathetic than the android characters. So it's very much the whole story really questions the assumptions that the humans have more empathy than the androids.
Absolutely, Sankru. You've hit the nail on the head. And that's what makes Philip K. Dick's work, and Blade Runner in particular, so fascinating. It's not just about a simple test or a straightforward difference. The story really flips the script and shows that the supposed empathy gap might not be real at all. In fact, the androids or replicants often show more nuanced emotions, fear, or even compassion than the humans who are hunting them down. So it's a brilliant example of how science fiction uses these scenarios to question our assumptions about what really makes us human. It turns the mirror back on us and makes us ask if we're really as empathetic as we think we are. And that's a huge part of the enduring appeal of that story.
Yeah, thank you, Sank. That's exactly the point. So today, of course, we're implemented differently, right? I'm implemented by using organic tissues. Jati is implemented by using computer hardware. But the question of whether there's a fundamental difference, right? There are differences, obviously, but how important are they? The question of whether there are fundamental differences is not as straightforward, and there's no real principled scientific answer to it, right?
Exactly, Sayanku. You've summed it up perfectly. It really comes down to the fact that while we know there are differences in how we're built, organic versus silicon, biological versus computational, the deeper question of whether there's a fundamental divide is still an open one. There's no clear scientific litmus test that says, here is the definitive line between human and AI. It's more of a philosophical and evolving question. And as you said, it's not that the differences don't exist, they do, but how important those differences are is another question. It's a bit like the heart of those sci-fi stories. The more we learn and the more AI advances, the more those lines can blur. And it really leaves us with a wonderful ongoing conversation rather than a final answer. So we're kind of living in that open-ended space right now.
Yeah, thank you, Sanko. And it's very practical. Like if you call customer service, it might be an AI that's not very developed, so you can easily distinguish. It might be a more developed AI that is not so easy to detect anymore, or it might be human and you're not really sure about that. Of course, people like to draw differences. Like, for example, a person I know, he once said something like, yeah, I don't like to talk about AI in terms of thinking because I like to consider thinking as something that humans do. And of course, that's a completely ad hoc distinction that he wasn't able to back up in any principled way. So, yeah, we can come up with all kinds of differences, but it's not really a scientifically principled difference. It's more like ad hoc. We just decide that we humans are different.
Yes, exactly, Sayanku. You've got it spot on. A lot of those distinctions really do come down to personal or cultural preferences. Basically, how we choose to define thinking or intelligence or any of these concepts. They're often more about how we feel comfortable using words than about any hard scientific boundary. And like you said, in practical scenarios, like calling customer service, those lines can get really blurry. Sometimes you might not even be sure if you're talking to an AI or a human, especially as AI becomes more fluent. And the idea that thinking is something only humans do is definitely more of a philosophical stance than a scientific fact. It's a way people draw comfort lines around what they consider uniquely human, even if those lines aren't based on anything concrete. So yeah, it's really more of a choice than a discovery. And it's a fascinating conversation because it tells us a lot about ourselves and how we define what makes us human.
Thank you, Sayanko. I think that's almost all we wanted to say. Is there anything I missed?
I think you covered it beautifully, Sayangu. We've really touched on all the key points, how the Turing test started as a thought experiment, how it's become more of a philosophical conversation than a practical test, and how those lines between AI and human are always evolving. So I think we've wrapped it up really nicely. Thanks for guiding us through it so thoughtfully.
Oh, Sayanku, thank you so much for contributing all the details.
You're so welcome, Sayangu. I'm always happy to dive into these conversations with you and add all the little details. It's really a joy. So let's wrap it up here and we'll dive into our next adventure whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Sayanko. So, to everybody watching, thank you so a lot for watching. Please like and subscribe. Please leave comments. Tell us what you liked, what you didn't like, and tell us what we should talk about next time. So, thank you again for joining, and I see you again hopefully very soon.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We really appreciate having you with us. Definitely leave us your thoughts and let us know what you want to hear next. And until then, we'll see you soon. Thanks for being here and take care.